So we've got a few folks. I'm going to start out by saying I'm not an expert in these. I'm dangerous enough to put a couple of them together and have them work. So that's probably a testament to how simple it is for someone to assemble this radio. So presentation, I'm not going to get super technical, but I'll go through a couple of features of these radios. And I'll start out by talking a little bit about what is it. So it's pronounced Bitx or micro Bitx. You'll hear various pronunciations, but essentially that's sort of the spelling and the nomenclature for them. What it is, basically it's a hackable firmware-based radio that you can. I got a couple different versions here, but they are a QRP, SSB, and CW, or just SSB transceiver kit. They were created by Asher Farhan. He is a well-known ham out of India that has been working on the Bitx series of radios for quite some time. The Bitx has many versions. The ones we're talking about today are the production versions that are actually, you can buy them in kit fashion. The origination of these is really around an early hacker community in India where they build these things by etching their own boards, populating with their own components, etc. Very rudimentary fashion because they don't have a lot of resources. But they basically turned this concept into a series of radios now that you can purchase, and they've been selling them worldwide for a couple of years now. They're relatively low cost. The micro Bitx is $120 shipped out of India, and the Bitx 40 is $60 US. And that's for the most part, all the parts, with the exception of a few things that we'll talk about, to put together your own radio. It uses what they call a Arduino. It's basically you see they transposed a couple letters from Arduino. It uses basically a Arduino Nano clone. Provided as part of the radio. It's essentially the brains of the radio, and that allows you to do the software updates, etc. to this. I won't go through this in detail, but I kind of want to highlight the difference between the two radios. The Bitx 40 came out probably 2 years ago as in kit fashion out of a company called HF Signals. This is a company that Asher Farhan had put together. Interesting thing about this company is as part of its process, it uses some local women to actually wind the toroids as part of their jobs. So the little toroids you'll see on there, which are incredibly small, someone's winding those things by hand as one of their jobs for this company. So pretty cool story of providing jobs for some of the folks in that area. The radio on the left it's a 40 meter QRP SSB transceiver only. It is hackable to include CW if you're so inclined. It essentially comes, and I'll pass around a kit. This is what it looks like when it arrives at your door. You have a fully populated board with a bunch of wires and stuff to assemble it, some other a tuning knob and some other things that go in there. But it pretty much is everything you would need. I'll pass this around for folks to take a look at. That's the Bitx 40. The micro Bitx is not much larger, but it comes in a similar package. It has a 7-watt transmitter. It does have the ability to upgrade the PA circuit on that. Like I said, hack is required for CW, and it's pretty basic. There's a fairly active community around that that's hacked some of this to provide some additional features. But really, a lot of what they poured a lot of energy into is the next version, which is the micro Bitx. You also see it as UBITX. This is a multi-band SSB and CW transceiver. It's continuous from 500 kilohertz to 300 megahertz. And that's continuous coverage. So anything that's in that window you can tune to. You could change the sideband selection, lower and upper. There's an interesting thing in this earlier one. It's called a galloping tuner. I don't know if anyone has heard of that before. I had never heard of it. But essentially, as you tune, the more you turn the knob, the faster it tunes, which is an acquired taste because you end up overshooting where you're trying to go many times before you get the hang of dialing it in. But it does allow you to tune very fast if you're moving from one end of the band to the other. They've taken that feature out of this next one, and it's actually a pretty slick designed radio. And then the things that the hacker community have done on top of that has really taken it to another level. Transmitters are 10 watt, up to 10 megahertz, 7 watts up to 21 megahertz, and then 2 watts on the 28 megahertz band. It does have the ability, it does have a built-in keyer for those that are CW inclined. Dual VFOs and some of the other features in there that are included in the radio. So I won't get into reading through all the details, but it's a hardware kit. The board is assembled already. So when you see it, it's tons of surface mount components, toroids, that kind of thing. Those are all pre-populated. You don't have to do any soldering on the board at all. So it comes fully completed and tested. So when you take it out of the box and assemble it, you can be on the air within hours, as long as you don't go nuts with cases like I did. It shows you all the stuff that's included in there. Really, the only thing it doesn't include is a case and a speaker. I think for the most part, everything else is in there. And you can. I'll pass around a couple of the things here. So I got the case going around. This is the mic that I mocked up. It's got a little electric mic in there, and then a little push button. Just built it out of PVC. Someone built them out of pill bottles and things like that. But it gives you sort of an idea of what you can do. That's an early prototype. So you have to do those kinds of things. So you'll just get a little mic element and a push button. You got to do something with it. So I tried with both of them on a separate wires, put it in there, and then I went lazy and modified a Baofeng mic to do it and take care of the rest of it. So that looks a lot better than my little PVC thing there. But it's interesting, a lot of folks when they first get this thing, they'll lay it out on a desk, wire it together, and get it operating without it even being in a case. You can really do a lot with this. Some people actually use the plastic case that it's in for the radio. Try to do something a little more durable, something a little more enclosed, but I'll talk a little bit about cases here in a minute. So I'm going to switch over here for a second, see if I can do this. We'll go to the video real quick. And this is Asher Farhan talking about this himself. I figured better him than I explain the radio. So
X, and I'm going to explain to you how this works. You can see that it's a fairly small and compact transceiver. It's just about 6 inches across and 6 inches deep. Fairly small and compact radio. And the front panel is pretty short and sweet. There are just 3 connectors here for the mic, key, and the ear jack. There's a volume control, and there is a function button. We'll come to the function button in a little bit. I'll show you how the function button works. So let's switch on this set and see how it works. The software on the Arduino is still under development as I'm shooting this. So some things may not work properly. For instance, the power meter here or the S meter here is still not completely functional, but that's okay. It's about 10:30 p.m. in the night. There is some DX coming through, but the conditions are pretty bad today. So now, as you can see, that as I'm turning my dial across, this entire rotation covers about 50 kilohertz. And when I move this to the very end, the frequency will start scanning down. There, you see that? And when I've come to the frequency of interest to me, I can push back again and it stays there. And to go forward and higher in frequencies, I'll just turn it completely clockwise. And now you can see it go up. So that's how you can start scanning the band itself. Once you get used to it, it's a pretty neat way of tuning the radio. Let's see if there's any interesting station here. I thought I heard something here. So that's as far as tuning within the band is concerned, but when you need to change the band, all you do is you hold this button down and then you move this knob. So I'm going to push this button down, and now you see that this display is moving pretty fast, and I can now go to whichever band I want to and leave it there, and then I can start tuning in from there. So that's how I change the bands. There is no concept of a band, but there is, like the old times, there's a band spread and a band set here. So that's pretty much it as far as tuning is concerned. Let me just go back to our 7 megahertz. There are a couple of other things which I need to show you. Okay, let me just go a little further down here. Okay, let's see this NCW here. It's a pretty chirpy signal there, very weak though. And when you need to transmit the CW, there is no mode. You just hold your key and start transmitting. So that's how you do CW. And then when you need to do SSB, all you need to do is move to the SSB band. Let me just move to the India's SSB segment, and then all you do is press the PTT and start talking. That's all there is to it. There's nothing more to it. You'll also realize that when we change from 7 to, let's say, 14 megahertz, it automatically changes to USB here. And when you go back to less than 10 megahertz, it comes back to LSB. So you don't really have to bother about these settings. You always know that the transceiver is going to make intelligent default options for you. Now, in order to turn the RIT and swap the VFOs, etc., all you need to do is again push the same button, and you fall into the menus. So you have various menus which says, set the USB carrier, LSB carrier, calibration, or you could swap from VFO-B to A and A to B, or turn the RIT off. It's right now off. You can turn it on, or again turn it off again. And you can also exit the menu. So that's how it works. And at times, when you have to confirm some setting, the confirm button is actually on the PTT, so you'll have to press the PTT to set and save some settings, for example, like the calibration or the USB or the LSB carrier settings. So that's just about how the radio works. It's a fairly simple to use radio, and it's fairly minimal in its design interface itself. Thank you so much.
So what you saw there was actually one of the early prototypes. They've changed the radio a bit since then. Like, you won't see the separate push button knob. It's actually integrated into the tuning knob. So if you need to hit the menu, just hit the button, do your changes, hit the button again, and it'll exit the menu. So this is a radio that's sort of constantly under rework, if you will, in a positive way. And so we'll talk a little bit about sort of how it's laid out and some of the hacks that people have worked on. Let me get this going again. So this is the layout of the boards. I think some of you have seen the one that's going around. The one on the right is the Bitx 40, and this is the micro Bitx on the left. The interesting thing about this is the way they laid these out is essentially the way the block diagram flows. So it's actually a pretty nicely laid out board, and I'll show you that. I'm going to skip this one and come back to that one. So this is the block diagram for the micro Bitx, and the way it essentially is laid out on this board is almost the exact identical way it's laid out on the actual circuit board. So when you're going through and tracing through, it makes it nice and logical. They also done a nice job of putting it together in terms of how it's how you actually build the thing. Like I said, you're not doing anything on the board here. This is all pre-assembled This is the Arduino power. That comes as an assembled board. I think the only thing you have to add is a 16 by 2 LCD screen. And then really everything from there is just wiring it up. And they even give you, if you see in the case, they even give you all the wires already pre-done for the most part. So all you're doing is some pretty light soldering for the most part. And as long as you can follow the instructions, you can pretty much put this thing together in an evening. So the brains of this unit really are sort of two things. One is the Arduino Nano. We talked about Arduinos before. It's essentially an open source, sort of community-driven microcontroller. And that's the place that holds the program for this particular radio. It comes already preloaded. So when you pull it out of the box, the thing's ready to go from a software perspective. If you do want to do any firmware updates, you need to be able to connect it to your computer and download the Arduino IDE, and then upload any new software to it. Software is constantly evolving. We'll talk a little bit about the folks that are actually designing this software and redesigning it with additional features. The other part is the clock generator. So that helps to generate the transmit and receive frequency. But that again, that's all kind of built in. I've got one here that is already put together. This is a slightly different version, but it essentially does the same thing. But you'll see how it's basically one package deal with the LCD as well as the board behind it. So I'll pass this around. So picking an enclosure is critical, I think. You'll see, I didn't bring my lunch here. This is actually a radio in here. So this was my first attempt at the Bitx 40. So the entire thing fits in there.
That's cool.
All you got to do is put the microphone in there and figure out how to power the thing, and you're good to go. This, like I said, is an early prototype. This was the first one that I built, but it's functioning. My first radio build, so I think I was pretty proud of it. But as you can tell, it's a little rudimentary, but I'll pass it around as well. I like the fact that the Tootsie Roll actually has a radio on his shoulder, so I thought it was appropriate as well. The other cases you can get is you can look at, these are 3D printed cases. So this is one that a guy, wolfland.net, he prints these things to spec. This is a Bitx 40. He also does them for the micro Bitx, and he gives you face plates, knobs, etc. So if you want to use a 3D printed kit, you can use those. And there's just like in most 3D printing, there are some open source places where you can print them yourself, but you have to have a pretty beefy 3D printer to print those. You can also find cases in lots of different places. I happen to get this one for 10 bucks on a surplus site. It actually already had the LCD screen cut out. I don't know about you guys, but cutting out an LCD screen is one of the most impossible things to do to make it look right. So this one appealed to me from that perspective. You can find a ton of them on Amazon, eBay. These are the same kind of cases people have been using in the hobby for many, many years. People have just repurposed them for these particular things. Two I wanted to note, I mentioned the 3D printing company that does these. There's also an Indian company that has been producing metal enclosures for these, and I've got a couple of pictures of those. So this is the metal enclosure. This is on my wish list, so I will be getting one of these. But the thing is already laid out for the Bitx. It's specifically made for that. You get it a bunch of different colors, but it's specifically laid out for that. So you have all the different front panel, volume, all the different headphone jack locations. You also on the back panel have a place for power, antenna, a fuse block, and then some other external peripherals. And the nice thing is they actually give you a bunch of this stuff as part of the case. So they're designing something around the serial board, some of these other, like the fuse doesn't normally come with it, so they've actually done a pretty nice job of giving you a solution paired with the radio kit to pretty much build a complete kit, having to go nowhere else for the parts.
You know how much those are, how much they cost?
They're $55 shipped to the States. I think it's like $35 for the case, and it's $20 to ship it. But lots of nice colors. It's pretty well done. And they also have them for the Bitx 40 as well. So this is not mine. This is actually the guy that I borrowed this presentation from, Andy Stewart. He was the guy that, he's done a lot of work in the early stages of the Bitx 40. I contacted him and asked him if I could use his presentation. He was kind enough to do it. His presentation was about 60 slides long, so I just added to that, and so we should get out of here around 1 a.m. So anyway, no, I actually pared it back quite a bit. He is a hardcore designer. He actually is designing individual circuits and things like that to modify that. I thought that was a little too intense for this presentation, but this is the internals of his. I'd like to say mine's a little cleaner, but this was, like I said, an early stage version here. Interesting thing that this guy does is he does a lot of work in the hams with disabilities, and so he is one of the guys that's done some of the handy ham stuff, if you've heard of that, for visually impaired hams. And so he's actually redesigning, there's a fork of the software to redesign it for visually disabled hams as well, which is pretty cool. So these are some of the cases, and these have been repurposed from different places. This one's upper left is a 3D printed one. This one was a repurposed computer case. This one was I think an eBay one, and then the ones on the right are some of the prefab metal ones. I don't know about you guys, but I could never get anything to look like that professional without buying it. So it's good to know that options are out there. So what's it take to actually build a thing? It's pretty easy once you get everything together. I hate to say it, but I probably spent 4 or 5 times as much time messing around with the case than actually putting the thing together. Getting the layout just right, drilling the holes, which I still didn't do right, and getting all the basic stuff wired up. If you have something that you know what you want to do, or something pretty simple, I think the assembly time you can do probably 4 to 5 hours. The drilling holes for the connectors and all that was probably the toughest thing and most stressful thing. Creating the LCD display. There's a lot of templates out there. I would recommend doing that if you can. If you're going to cut a hole for an LCD display, it's pretty tough to get it just right. So, measure twice, cut once, hopefully. Or get a big file, which is what I usually do. Let's see. Wiring harnesses are pretty simple. Soldering the wires to the connectors. It's important to get a case that's big enough. My first try was at a case about this size, for a metal case, and I quickly abandoned that because I just did not have enough room to work in. When you're trying to put these connectors in and possibly do some soldering inside the box, it gets a little tricky. So go with something with a little more space, and that's what I did on this second one. Keep the cable length short, minimize RF. Like I said, software's already loaded, and it does not come with any instruction manual. Everything's online. So both the assembly manual, the wiring diagram, the circuit diagrams, all those things are online. The other thing is there are very robust communities that support this as well, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a few minutes here. So preparing for first power on, this does pretty much take 12 volts straight. It will tolerate up to 13.8. Anything beyond that gets a little hard on the radio. I did most of my testing with a dummy load, using the plug-in external speaker. There's an interesting thing we'll talk about with the headphones. There's a very audible pop when you turn this thing on, and if you have your headphones on when it's on, it will be painful. It's just an idiosyncrasy of the radio. Connect the microphone. Basically, you hear the speaker pop. That's a good sign that things are working. Sniff for smoke, I think that's true of anything you build. And then you look at the LCD to see what it reads. If you've got something on the LCD you're probably in pretty good shape. And then it's got a diagnostic to tell you whether the thing's working or not. It tells you to tune it a certain way and then speak into the microphone and it should register. So it's pretty simple to get started. Very easy calibration. The Bitx 40 is a slightly different calibration process. The micro Bitx, it has calibration on board. So first one, you would only need just a multimeter. It would help you do that. So the disclaimer, and this does require a disclaimer. These things are works in progress. There are a number of things that were noted in the production and the design of this that require some attention for you to it'll operate out of the box, but there's some, like I said, some idiosyncrasies that you have to pay attention to. A number of fixes that are proposed and provided. In some cases, if you get a later version, they've already fixed some of it. Like this audio amp thing, they got a series of bad chips that were shipped. They were wrong voltage. They would work for a little bit, but then they would crack in half and not work. Guess whose radio had this in it? Yours truly. But I found that out before I powered it on, was able to take the chip off the board and put a new chip in, and was able to get that done easily. There's no reverse polarity on it. They do provide a crowbar circuit for it to protect the circuit, but it's not great. I actually did a reverse polarity mod on this one, so that I don't have to worry about that. Like I mentioned, audio pop, and there's also some issues around broadcast interference for folks that are in certain areas. If you have strong broadcast stations, you can build a filter for that. There have been some fixes, and fixes suggested. It does really require some. This is not an entry-level radio. This shouldn't be your first one, I think. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it does require some knowledge about a few things. You have to have a knowledge and ability to read schematics. A lot of the fixes require you to go down to, possibly moving some of the resistors and those kinds of things. If you need to do a fix, you need to know where those are and how to read those. Sometimes you need intermediate to advanced levels of soldering for surface mount components. This is, again, if you're more troubleshooting. If you're just assembling the thing, basic soldering skills are more than adequate. Requires a ton of patience. There have been more than one time I've wanted to throw this thing against the wall, because they are particular. But if you read up on them and you follow the instructions, you usually are in pretty good shape. And then the willingness to learn and try new things. This is a little bit of an a la carte menu type radio, in that you can go and pick and choose what features you want to add in, what hardware modifications you want to make, what software modifications you want to accept. Those are all things that you can do on your own. Probably not a lot of radios that you can do that with. There is no help desk. So if you're expecting to buy this radio and then call someone for assembly instruction help, doesn't exist. You can get some email help potentially, but really what you should rely on is the very active Facebook and groups.io community. They've created user-based manuals, they've created new schematics, they've created all sorts of tips and tricks to help folks put these things together. The Facebook community is actually very active. I'll show you those here in a bit, but that's where people get their help. I've reached out to them a number of times when I've run into issues, and that you always find someone being very helpful in that process. So hacking the Bitx, and that's part of the reason why this thing exists, is this is really a software modifiable radio. There have been a number of hacks that have been identified by the community. I'm saying hacks in a good way. There's fixes and then there's hacks. Hacks are improvements that folks have worked on themselves or thrown out to the community, and someone has come back with a solution to enhance the radio. These are just a few in the hardware area that have basically either built a solution, designed a solution, and many of these are tested and proven, so you can go out and find out which ones worked for folks and which ones didn't. There's also an active community around designing boards for these things, and I got a few around here. So these are circuit boards that I got from a guy in Australia who designed these things and basically sells them at cost. So this one is a Arduino replacement for an I2C with an I2C connection, so you can use different types of screens other than the 16 by 2 LCD screen. Again, designed that in EagleCAD, basically bought a bunch of the boards and sells them pretty much at cost for shipping and such. These tiny things here, and I'll pass these around, are filters. And so you have to wind the toroids and do some other stuff on there, but those are filters that you can integrate into the radio. And this last one is a CW filter. And I ordered these from him, I think they were $12 shipped. So still requires some building time, but there are a number of other mods out there as well that you can essentially just go to the folks that have designed these and either get the instructions on the solution, or a lot of times they're selling a board as part of sort of the open source community. Software modifications are really based around the Arduino platform. The Bitx 40 so all these come, like I said, factory installed, but then there have been some hands that have modified these things. I mentioned Andy Stewart already, but Allard Munter's PE1 NWL has been driving a lot of the modifications to the Bitx 40 software. And then for the micro Bitx, they're basically called 3 forks. Forks are basically variants of the original software. KD0YMC is probably the most prominent one. This guy is crazy prolific with the modifications to the software, has done a ton of interesting things. The last one that I saw is he's actually adding S-meter to the radio, and he's the one that maintains a lot of the software. And then there's two others, the W0EB and the VU2SPF are the two other primary developers of the software. And you can pretty much update it and pick and choose what features you want. So it's pretty cool. It does require you to know the Arduino IDE, so you have to have some familiarity of uploading that software. And then the big challenge of getting drivers to work for your computer. Since some of these things are clones, they don't necessarily always play nicely with your computer. So I spent probably 4 hours on that yesterday dealing with a different issue. Not around this is around something else. So is it a good first radio? Based on my experience and what research I've done, I would say no. And the reason for that is it does really require some knowledge of, and I would say advanced knowledge of how some of these things work in terms of just like I said, reading the schematics, troubleshooting, and also just understanding some of the issues that it might have, and whether you're up to doing board level tweaks to your radio. The other is, and you talked with Bob about this, these are QRP radios. They are a challenging first radio if you are looking to get into SSB HF. CW is a little easier, but it is a challenge because it's harder to make contacts, and so it makes it a little bit more difficult to do that. So I mentioned radio theory and the troubleshooting electronic circuits. They can be temperamental, and if you make a mistake, you may not be able to recover it. The good thing is you're not out a whole lot of money. It does really give you a good opportunity to, and part of the reason why I got them was to increase my electronics knowledge. You really can get into this thing. I mean, I wouldn't open my Yaesu 857 and start poking around trying to do a modification. Here, if something happens, I'm not out too much money, and it does have some flexibility to recover. It just may not be worth it for you. But it is I would say, and I encourage folks to come up and take a look at it. It's pretty simple to assemble, but again, it does require some patience to put the thing together and to get on the air with it. But if you're the right general class person, you could probably jump into this thing without too much trouble. I think that is my last slide. Oh, I got a summary slide. So they're fun, hackable HF solutions. They can be a test bed for learning. Like I said, that's what I got mine for, was really to start figuring out how to. I have no technical background whatsoever. Marketing major in college, so I shied away from math and engineering on purpose. So for me, this is really a great way for me to learn electronics in a kind of a real world application. If you're willing to put in time, it is well documented, and there's a lot of information out there and a lot of help. The downside of it is constantly evolving. So there is no sort of stable baseline of the things that are happening out there other than the original product. But the good thing is the groups are active and there's a lot of history with these radios. Hacking is encouraged. I haven't gotten to the point of actually adapting any of the software for my purposes, but that's something that's easily doable. And a lot of folks are out there creating their own version of the software. And like I said, relatively low cost.
It's actually down to $109 now.
And if you want something fast from India, you can get a DHL to you as well. So, the last slide here, I won't go over it, but this is essentially some of the references that'll help you. So when we send the slides out, you can click on these links and get access to the different sites. Like I said, there's a very active Facebook and where's the other one? Facebook group, and then these two sites, the Bitx hacks and the UBITX net, are essentially sites that have accumulated all the hacks. So you don't have to go and chase them all over the place. They're in a couple of different places. And then the software place I mentioned is this site called hamsky.com. So I threw a lot at you there. Questions, comments? You're welcome to come up and take a look at this radio.
How many contacts?
How many contacts? None yet, none so far. Some listening contacts, I should say, but I haven't. I was troubleshooting a problem with the mic, so self-inflicted problem with the mic. So I've been very busy at work, so it was very difficult to. I was putting the final touches on this weekend. So no questions?
Have you seen any information of guys using it in the digital modes?
Oh yeah, quite active. In fact, there have been folks that have modified it for Whisper, FT8. People are doing all kinds of digital modes. That's another big area where people are starting to modify the interfaces to this so they can use it with things like Signal Link and other interfaces to get on the net that way. Great. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.